Hey guys, tonight we begin with... It's the sound of wind whispering through tall grass, rustling the leaves of ancient oak trees that stand solitary sentinel on a rolling English landscape. It seems peaceful, idyllic almost. But if you were to stand here in the seemingly serene countryside centuries ago, this same wind might have carried a different story. The distant bleating of sheep. Yes, but also the fainter, almost erased echoes of a village that once thrived, a community that lived, worked, and died on this very soil. A village that was, in a chillingly modern-sounding phrase, legally erased. This is not a tale of invading armies or catastrophic plagues in the usual sense. It's a story of a slower, more insidious destruction. A rite of ruin wielded by powerful landlords, often under the guise of progress and law, all for the sake of, well, as our title grimly suggests, for sheep. Imagine yourself a peasant farmer in medieval or early modern England. Your world is small, defined by the rhythm of the seasons, the boundaries of your village, and the often heavy hand of your lord. Life is hard, unquestionably, a cycle of back-breaking labor from dawn till dusk, but it has a certain predictability, a rootedness. You are part of a community. Your family has tilled these strips of land in the great open fields for generations, and you have access, however limited by ancient custom, to common lands for grazing your meager livestock, for gathering firewood, for foraging. It's a life lived on the edge, perhaps, but it is your life, your world. The reality check for tonight. The good old days were rarely good for the common folk, and the rights you thought you possessed as a villager, a tenant on the Lord's manor, were often as fragile as a dry leaf in that same whispering wind. What happens when the economic landscape shifts, when a new commodity becomes more profitable than your toil, when your lord, armed with new laws or ancient prerogatives twisted to his advantage, decides that his land would be better served by four-legged, wool-producing tenants rather than two-legged, rent-paying human ones. You might find your entire existence, your home, your livelihood, your very community being systematically, legally, and often brutally dismantled. This is the anatomy of a particular kind of feudal despotism, where the pen and the surveyor's chain can be as devastating as any sword. So, before you get comfortable, before we witness the slow, agonizing erasure of your village, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always a profound experience to connect with our global community of those seeking to understand the often harsh realities that lie beneath the surface of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We are about to explore the historical phenomenon of Enclosure Edicts, the legal and social mechanisms by which medieval and early modern landlords in England and elsewhere systematically dispossessed peasants, destroyed their villages, and replaced them with vast, profitable sheep pastures. We will walk in your muddy, worn-out shoes, feel your dawning fear, your desperate resistance, and ultimately, your utter ruin, all for the sake of wool. This is the story of how lives, homes, and hope were legally obliterated, often with cold, bureaucratic impunity, Before the shadow of enclosure fell across your world, your life as a peasant farmer in this English village is woven into the ancient rhythms of the manorial system. It's a life of undeniable hardship, yes, a constant cycle of toil dictated by the sun and the seasons, but it also possesses a certain communal structure, a framework of rights and obligations that, however weighted in favor of the Lord, provides a semblance of order and predictability. You are not a solitary individual battling the elements. You are part of a village, a collective bound to the land and to each other by centuries of custom. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in your small, perhaps wattle and daub, cottage. The air is cool, smelling of wood smoke, damp earth, and livestock. Your home is simple, probably consisting of 1 or 2 rooms, the floor of beaten earth, a central hearth for cooking and warmth. You share this space with your family, your spouse, your children, perhaps an aging parent. Privacy, as you or I might understand it, is a luxury unknown, but there is a sense of shared existence, of lives intertwined. Your first task of the day might be to tend to the meager livestock you are permitted to keep, a cow for milk, a few chickens for eggs, perhaps a pig foraging for scraps. These animals are precious, a vital source of sustenance and a small measure of wealth. The agricultural heart of your village is the open field system. You don't own a neat, rectangular farm in the modern sense. Instead, the arable land surrounding the village is divided into several large, unfenced fields, often 2 or 3, to allow for crop rotation and fallow periods. Within these great fields, each peasant family, including yours, cultivates a number of scattered strips of land. These strips are long and narrow, their allocation often based on ancient tradition or the decision of the village elders under the Lord's authority. You work these strips with simple tools, a heavy wooden plow, perhaps shared among several families and drawn by a team of oxen, also possibly shared or provided by the Lord for a due, a hoe for weeding, a sickle for reaping at harvest time. The work is back-breaking, the yields often modest and heavily dependent on the weather and the quality of the soil. The medical hardship of agrarian life is constant. Strained backs, calloused hands, the ever-present risk of injury from tools or animals, and the slow wear and tear on the body from years of relentless physical labor. Beyond your individual strips in the arable fields, a crucial element of your survival and a cornerstone of village life are the common lands, the commons. These are areas of pasture, woodland, heath, or fen that are, by ancient custom, available for use by all the villagers, though often under regulations set by the lord of the manor. Here, you can graze your cow or your pig. You can gather firewood to keep your cottage warm through the long, cold winters. A quirky tidbit, specific types of wood, or the right to take fallen wood versus cutting live trees, were often strictly regulated. You might forage for wild berries, nuts, or herbs for your pottage, or for simple remedies. The commons are a vital safety net, a shared resource that supplements what you can grow on your own strips. The scholarly debate often examines the true extent of these rights. Were they genuine entitlements, or merely privileges granted and revocable at the Lord's whim? For you, however, they are simply an essential part of life, an assumed and necessary component of your precarious existence. Life on the manor is also defined by a web of obligations to your lord. You are likely an unfree peasant, a serf or villain, bound to the land. You owe your lord rent, often paid not in cash, which is scarce, but in a portion of your harvest. You also owe him labor service, a certain number of days each week, or at specific times of the year like plowing or harvest. You must work on the Lord's own land, the domain, cultivating his crops for his benefit. Failure to fulfill these obligations can result in fines, punishment, or even in extreme cases, the loss of your land strips. The gory history of the manorial system is less about overt violence, though that certainly existed, and more about this relentless, systemic extraction of labor and resources from the peasantry. This is your world, a world of hard work, communal ties, customary rights, and binding obligations, all lived under the watchful eye and often heavy hand of the Lord. It is a life of human endurance, a delicate balance soon to be shattered by the encroaching hedges and the insatiable hunger of sheep. Your life on the manor, with its predictable rhythms of plowing your strips and utilizing the commons, continues for a time, a fragile existence passed down through generations. But unseen forces, vast economic currents, are beginning to stir far beyond the boundaries of your village, forces that will soon reshape your world in the most brutal way imaginable. You, the peasant farmer, are blissfully unaware of the grand tapestry of international trade, but its threads are slowly, inexorably, tightening around your quiet life. The shocking secret beginning to unfold is that the very wool on the backs of the sheep, grazing peacefully on distant hills, is becoming more valuable than the grain you painstakingly cultivate, more precious in the eyes of some than your entire community's existence. Imagine the bustling port cities of England, or the great trading centers of Flanders and Italy in the late medieval and early modern periods, perhaps the 15th, 16th, and even into the 17th centuries, as this process of enclosure gained momentum at different times in different places. English wool, particularly from breeds like the Cotswold Lion, is renowned throughout Europe for its quality, long, fine, and perfect for weaving into luxurious cloth. You see merchants, their coffers heavy with coin, eagerly buying up bales of this golden fleece. Cloth production in places like Flanders is a booming industry, clothing the wealthy and powerful across the continent. And as demand soars, so too does the price of raw wool. Your lord, the master of the manor to whom you owe your fealty and your labor, is no fool. He hears the whispers of this burgeoning wealth. He sees other landowners, perhaps his peers or rivals, amassing fortunes not from the traditional rents and dues squeezed from peasant agriculture, but from the vast profits to be made by converting arable land, the land you and your neighbors farm, into extensive sheep pastures. The human endurance required to simply maintain a peasant holding, to pay the Lord's dues, and feed your family from your meager strips, is already immense. But now, a new, more insidious pressure begins to build. Your lord starts to look at his lands, at your village, not as a source of loyal tenants and agricultural produce, but as a potential sheep run, a source of easily acquired, highly profitable wool. The medical hardship here is economic, but it will soon translate into very real physical suffering, as the profitability of wool outstrips that of traditional farming, especially on land perhaps less suited to intensive grain production, or where labor costs, even for serfs, are perceived as too high compared to the low labor needs of sheep farming. The incentive for lords to clear their lands of people and replace them with sheep becomes almost irresistible. One quirky, or rather, darkly ironic saying that began to circulate during some periods of intense enclosure was that sheep are eating men. It's a stark, brutal metaphor for a process that saw human communities displaced for the sake of animal husbandry and profit. The scholarly debate often considers the complex interplay of factors driving the enclosure movement. Rising population in some periods, putting pressure on land, the development of more market-oriented agriculture, the desire of landlords to consolidate their holdings for more efficient, i.e., profitable management, and undeniably the sheer naked greed of some. For you, the peasant tilling your ancestral strips, these grand economic theories are unknown. You only begin to sense a change in the Lord's demeanor, perhaps a new hardness in his steward's eyes, a greater interest in the exact boundaries of your land and the extent of the common fields. The shocking secret is that your very existence, your ancient way of life, is now being weighed on a merchant's scale against the price of a sack of wool, and the balance is tipping dangerously against you. The golden fleece is about to become your village's shroud, the subtle shifts in the Lord's priorities, the new calculations of profit and loss being made in the distant manor house, or even further afield in London, begin to filter down to your village, not as official pronouncements, but as unsettling whispers, half-heard rumors, and a growing, pervasive sense of unease. You, our peasant farmer, are accustomed to the cycles of nature, the demands of your lord, the occasional hardship of a bad harvest or a harsh winter. But this new threat is different. It's an unknown, a creeping dread that something fundamental to your way of life is about to be irrevocably altered. The shocking secret is the slow, agonizing dawning of a realization that your world is no longer secure. Imagine yourself in the village alehouse after a long day's toil, or perhaps gathered with neighbors around a communal fire on a chilly evening. The usual talk of weather, crops, and local gossip is now tinged with a new anxiety. Someone might mention seeing the Lord Steward pacing out boundaries in the common fields with unfamiliar men carrying chains and measuring rods. Another might have overheard a servant from the manor house speaking of the Lord's newfound interest in sheep farming, or his admiration for a neighboring lord who has recently enclosed his lands and is now reaping handsome profits from wool. You try to piece together these fragments, these unsettling portents. The human endurance required to live with such uncertainty is a heavy burden. Your livelihood, your home, your community, everything is tied to the land and to the customary arrangements that have governed its use for generations. The idea that these arrangements could be swept aside, that you could be driven from the fields your ancestors tilled, is almost unthinkable. Yet the rumors persist, growing more detailed, more alarming, with each passing week. The medical hardship here is not yet physical illness, but the gnawing stress, the sleepless nights, the fear that saps your strength and clouds your days. You might see your village elders, men respected for their wisdom and their knowledge of ancient customs, trying to seek clarification from the Lord's reeve or bailiff, only to be met with evasive answers or cold indifference. The power imbalance is stark. You and your fellow villagers are tenants, serfs perhaps, bound to the manor, with few, if any, legal means to challenge the Lord's will if he is determined to change the use of his land. The concept of an Enclosure Edict, a formal legal instrument that could legitimize your dispossession, might be a terrifying abstract notion, something you hear about happening in other distant manners, but surely not here, not to your village. One quirky, or rather tragically common, human response to such looming threats is denial, or a desperate clinging to the hope that things will somehow work out, that the Lord will see reason, or that the old ways will prevail. You might try to dismiss the rumors as idle gossip, or reassure yourself that your Lord, for all his sternness, would never do something so drastic, so cruel. But deep down, a cold seed of fear has been planted. The scholarly debate often examines the varying degrees of peasant awareness and resistance to early enclosures. In some cases, there were organized protests, petitions, even violent outbreaks. In others, communities seem to have been overwhelmed, unable to comprehend or effectively oppose the forces arrayed against them. For you, in your small, isolated village, the shocking secret is this slow erosion of certainty, this creeping realization that the very ground beneath your feet is no longer solid, no longer yours by ancient right, but subject to the cold, impersonal calculations of profit and progress. The whispers in the village are the first tremors of an earthquake that will soon shatter your world. The unknown edict, the unseen surveyor's line, these are the harbingers of your utter ruin. The whispers and rumors that have been unsettling your village eventually give way to a harsher, more concrete reality. The Lord's intention to enclose the common lands and convert arable fields into sheep pasture is no longer a matter of speculation. It is a plan set in motion, often justified and implemented through a veneer of legality, through mechanisms that, on the surface, appear to be orderly and even lawful. You, our peasant farmer, are now confronted with the shocking secret of how law itself, in the hands of the powerful, can become an instrument of dispossession and ruin for the powerless. The process of enclosure, particularly in England, where it was most widespread and well documented over several centuries, evolved over time. In the earlier medieval period, enclosure might have occurred through more informal agreements, or simply by the Lord asserting his will and gradually encroaching upon common lands, or consolidating scattered peasant strips into larger, more manageable, for him, blocks. This often involved complex negotiations, coercion, or the exploitation of existing feudal dues and obligations to pressure tenants into relinquishing their rights. You might find yourself summoned to the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward, and persuaded to agree to a reallotment of land that invariably favors the lord's new sheep farming enterprise. The medical hardship here is the stress and anxiety of these unequal negotiations, where your ability to refuse is virtually non-existent. Later, particularly from the 15th and 16th centuries onwards during the Tudor period, and then again with even greater intensity in the 18th and 19th centuries, enclosure was often formalized through specific legal instruments, including royal edicts or, most significantly, Acts of Parliament. These enclosure acts were pieces of legislation that authorized the enclosure of common fields and wastelands in a particular parish or manor. On paper, they often spoke of improving agriculture, of making land use more efficient, of benefiting the realm as a whole. You can almost hear the quirky tidbit of a lord piously declaring that enclosing the land is for the greater good, while conveniently overlooking the fact that the primary beneficiary is himself and his burgeoning flocks of sheep. The process of obtaining an Enclosure Act, especially in the later parliamentary period, was often heavily weighted in favor of the large landowners. They had the wealth, the influence, and the legal expertise to petition Parliament and push through the necessary legislation. Smallholders and commoners, like yourself, often had little effective voice in this process. You might hear of commissioners being appointed to survey the land and reallocated, but their decisions were rarely in your favor. Your ancient customary rights to the commons, rights that were often unwritten but had been recognized for generations, were systematically extinguished, replaced by a smaller, often poorer quality plot of land elsewhere. If you were lucky enough to receive any land at all, many simply lost their access to the commons entirely, a devastating blow to their ability to survive. The scholarly debate often highlights the inherent injustice of these legal processes. While proponents argued that enclosure led to more productive agriculture, which is debatable, especially in terms of overall social well-being, critics then and now point to the massive social upheaval, the dispossession of countless peasant families, and the creation of a landless rural proletariat. The gory history here is not necessarily one of overt, immediate violence, though resistance was sometimes met with force, but of a slow, grinding, legally sanctioned destruction of a traditional way of life. The shocking secret is that the very laws designed to uphold order and property could be so effectively turned into tools for the powerful to dispossess the weak. For you, the peasant, this lawful path to ruin is a bewildering, terrifying maze with no escape, leading inexorably to the loss of your land, your home, and your hope. The Lord's intent to enclose the lands of your village is now backed by the force of an edict or a freshly passed act. The abstract legal pronouncements soon take on a terrifyingly concrete form. You see them arrive in your village, unfamiliar men, carrying strange instruments, long measuring chains, wooden siding poles, compasses, and rolls of parchment. These are the surveyors, the agents of the enclosure commissioners, tasked with mapping, dividing, and reallocating the land according to the new legal framework. For you, our peasant farmer, their chains and markers are not tools of precision and order, but instruments that are quite literally mapping out your misery, drawing the lines that will erase your world. Imagine the scene. These men, often viewed with suspicion and hostility by the villagers, move methodically across the open fields where your family has tilled their scattered strips for generations. They drive stakes into the ground, stretch their chains across familiar landmarks, and make cryptic notes on their parchments. You and your neighbors watch from a distance, a knot of cold fear tightening in your stomachs. Every line they draw, every boundary they mark, feels like a nail in the coffin of your traditional way of life. The common lands, once open to all for grazing and foraging, are now being carved up, designated for the Lord's exclusive use, or reallocated in ways that benefit the larger, wealthier landholders. The human endurance required to witness this systematic dismantling of your world, to see your ancestral connection to the land being measured, quantified, and then redefined by strangers acting on the authority of a distant power, is immense. There might be muttered curses, veiled threats, or perhaps just a heavy, resentful silence from the villagers. But direct resistance is often futile and dangerous. These surveyors are usually accompanied by the Lord's men, or they carry the weight of parliamentary authority. To interfere with their work is to invite swift and harsh punishment. The medical hardship here is the profound stress, the sense of powerlessness, the dawning realization that your life is being irrevocably changed by forces beyond your control. You might try to appeal to the surveyors, to explain the ancient customs, to point out that the small strip of land by the stream is crucial for watering your single cow, or that the patch of woodland provides the only fuel for your family's hearth. But they are often deaf to such pleas. Their task is technical, objective, to implement the letter of the Enclosure Award, which rarely takes into account the complex web of customary rights and communal dependencies that have sustained village life for centuries. One quirky, or rather tragically ironic, detail is that the very efficiency and rationality claimed by proponents of enclosure often translated into a brutal disregard for human well-being and established social bonds. The scholarly debate often examines the role of these surveyors and commissioners. Were they merely dispassionate professionals carrying out a legal mandate, or were they often complicit, either actively or passively, in a process that favored the wealthy and powerful? The shocking secret is that the surveyor's chain, a symbol of precision and scientific measurement, became, for countless peasant communities, an instrument of profound injustice, a tool that neatly and lawfully redrew the map of their lives, almost always to their devastating detriment. As you watch them work, each stake driven into the earth feels like a stake driven into the heart of your village, a cold, hard demarcation of your impending ruin. The surveyors have completed their grim task, their maps and measurements approved, the legalities of the Enclosure Edict or Act now firmly in place. And then, the physical transformation of your world begins, a shocking secret unfolding before your disbelieving eyes as the very landscape of your life is violently, irrevocably altered. Hedges are planted, fences erected, stone walls built, carving up the once open fields, and most devastatingly, enclosing the common lands that were the lifeblood of your peasant household. Your world, once a shared tapestry of individual strips and communal resources, is literally shrinking, its vital arteries being choked off. Imagine the arrival of the laborers, often hired by the lord or the larger landowners who benefit most from the enclosure. They come with spades, axes, and billhooks, and begin the work of delineating the new private holdings. You see them planting hawthorn saplings that will grow into thick, impenetrable hedges, or digging ditches and raising banks to mark new boundaries. Where once your cow could roam freely on the common pasture after the harvest, there is now a newly planted hedge, a barrier you cannot cross. Where once you could gather firewood from the woodland edge, or allow your pig to forage for acorns, there is now a fence and a sign, perhaps, warning against trespass, a concept almost alien to your understanding of communal rights. The loss of the commons is a catastrophic blow, a medical hardship in the most fundamental sense, as it directly impacts your ability to feed your family and sustain your meager livelihood. The commons were not just wasteland, as proponents of enclosure often claimed. They were an essential integrated part of the peasant economy. They provided grazing for the milk cow that gave your children nourishment, for the pig that might be your only source of meat through the winter, for the geese whose feathers filled your bedding. They offered vital resources, firewood for warmth and cooking, wild fruits, nuts, and herbs for your pottage, rushes for thatching your roof, bracken for animal bedding. Without access to these, your already precarious existence becomes almost untenable. You are forced to reduce your livestock or find new, often non-existent ways to feed them. The human endurance of simply trying to make ends meet in the face of this shrinking world is pushed to its absolute limit. You might see your neighbors, equally desperate, attempting to continue using the commons as they always have, only to be driven off by the Lord's men, perhaps fined, or even physically punished. The sense of injustice is overwhelming. These were rights, you believed, sanctioned by generations of custom, rights that allowed your community to survive. Now, they are being extinguished by a piece of parchment and a line of newly planted thorns. One quirky, or rather deeply poignant, aspect of this process is how quickly the natural landscape itself begins to reflect the new social order. The open communal fields give way to a checkerboard of private enclosures, a visual representation of a more individualistic, and for many, a far harsher world. The scholarly debate often focuses on the long-term ecological and social consequences of this widespread loss of common land. While some argue it led to more efficient land use in the long run, it undeniably destroyed a complex and often sustainable system of communal resource management and plunged countless peasant families into destitution. The gory history here is this low, agonizing death of a way of life, the strangulation of a community's ability to provide for itself. As the hedges rise higher, as the fences become more formidable, you feel the walls closing in, your world becoming smaller, bleaker, and more terrifyingly dependent on the whim of a lord who now controls everything, all for the sake of his sheep. The hedges have risen, the common lands are lost, and your ability to sustain your family on your reallocated, often smaller and poorer quality, strips of land becomes increasingly impossible. The shocking secret of the enclosure process often culminates in this final brutal act. The eviction notice. It arrives perhaps delivered by the Lord's grim-faced bailiff, a cold, impersonal piece of parchment that with a few strokes of a pen and the imprint of a wax seal officially severs your family's connection to the land they have worked for generations, sealing your fate and casting you out into an uncertain and likely terrifying future. Imagine that moment. You are in your small cottage, the one your grandfather might have built, the hearth where your children were born. The bailiff arrives, his expression unreadable, or perhaps tinged with a perfunctory sympathy that offers no real comfort. He reads the notice, or perhaps just hands it to you, if you are among the few who can decipher the clerk's script. The words are stark, legalistic, devoid of any human compassion. You are to vacate the premises, to remove yourself, your family, and your meager possessions from this land, this home, by a certain date. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal. The medical hardship of this moment is not a physical blow, but a devastating psychological one. The sudden, absolute loss of security, identity, and hope. What are your options? You have virtually none. The notice is backed by the full weight of the Lord's authority, and often by the law of the land as defined by the Enclosure Act or award that governs your manor. To resist is to invite violence, imprisonment, or even worse. You might plead, you might beg for more time, you might appeal to the Lord's mercy, but such appeals are rarely successful. The decision has been made. The land is deemed more profitable for sheep than for people like you. The human endurance required to simply absorb this catastrophic news, to explain it to your bewildered children, to face the utter desolation of your future, is almost beyond words. You look around your small cottage, at the few possessions your family has accumulated over generations. A wooden chest, a few pots and pans, a homespun blanket, perhaps a cherished, if worn, religious icon. Now, you must decide what little you can carry on your backs as you are turned out onto the road. Where will you go? What will you do? The village, as you knew it, is ceasing to exist. Your neighbors are facing the same fate. The communal bonds that once provided a measure of support are themselves being shattered. One quirky, or rather deeply tragic detail is that often the very cottages themselves were slated for demolition by the Lord to make way for open pasture, ensuring there was nothing left for the evicted peasants to return to. The scholarly debate considers the varying levels of compensation, if any, offered to evicted tenants. Sometimes there might have been a small, inadequate sum, or the offer of an even smaller plot of marginal land elsewhere. More often, especially for those with less secure tenure, like cottagers or squatters on the commons, there was nothing. They were simply cast adrift. The gory history of Enclosure is written not just in the destruction of homes and fields, but in the shattered lives and broken spirits of countless peasant families. This eviction notice, this cold piece of parchment, is not just a legal document. It is your sentence to a life of vagrancy, poverty, and profound uncertainty, a testament to the Lord's absolute right of ruin. The date on the eviction notice arrives, a day of dread you have tried to push from your mind, but which now confronts you with an unyielding, brutal finality. The Lord's men, perhaps the same bailiff who delivered the notice, or a more formidable group of estate workers, possibly even armed retainers if resistance is anticipated, appear at your cottage door. This is the moment when the abstract legality of the Enclosure Edict transforms into a terrifyingly physical act of dispossession. You, our peasant farmer, are about to be, as our title grimly states, legally erased from the landscape you have always known as home. Imagine the scene. Your meager possessions, those few essential items you can carry, are already bundled, a pathetic testament to a lifetime's labor. Your children huddle beside you, their faces pale with fear and incomprehension. There might be tears, pleas, perhaps even desperate, futile attempts at resistance from some of your neighbors who are facing the same fate. But the Lord's men are implacable, their expressions often hard, their task clear. They are here to enforce the will of their master, to clear the land. The human endurance of facing this moment, of being forcibly uprooted from the only home you have ever known, is a profound and agonizing test. You might be ordered out, your family herded away like livestock, or, in some cases, the process is even more brutal. If there is any hesitation, any sign of defiance, force might be used. The gory history of some enclosures includes accounts of cottages being physically dismantled or even set ablaze by the Lord's agents, while the occupants are still scrambling to retrieve their belongings, or shortly after they have been driven out. You watch, helpless, as the roof timbers of your home are pulled down, the wattle and daub walls kicked in, the small garden you tended trampled underfoot. The destruction is swift, methodical, and utterly devastating. This isn't just the loss of a shelter. It's the obliteration of your past, your identity, your connection to place. The medical hardship in this moment is not just the physical strain of being displaced, but the profound psychological trauma. The shock, the grief, the rage, the overwhelming sense of injustice. These emotions would be a heavy burden, with no outlet, no recourse. For children, witnessing such an event, seeing their home destroyed, and their parents humiliated, would be a scar carried for life. One quirky, or rather deeply cynical aspect of this legal erasure is that it was often framed as being for the improvement of the land. Your home, your way of life, was deemed an impediment to progress, an obstacle to the more profitable enterprise of sheep farming. The scholarly debate often examines the varying degrees of violence and compassion, or lack thereof, employed during these evictions. While some lords might have offered minimal assistance or allowed a slightly longer period for departure, many others were ruthless, eager to clear their lands as quickly as possible to maximize their profits from wool. The shocking secret is the sheer, cold-blooded efficiency with which entire communities could be dismantled, their human inhabitants swept aside like inconvenient debris, all under the sanction of law. As you are driven from your land, looking back at the smoking ruins or the empty space where your home once stood, you are a living embodiment of what it means to be legally erased, a ghost in your own former life, your future now a terrifying blank. You and your family, along with your fellow villagers, have been driven from your homes, your cottages, perhaps already smoldering ruins, or marked for demolition. The legal erasure is nearly complete. Now, you witness the final, haunting transformation of the landscape, a shocking secret that underscores the brutal finality of the Enclosure Edicts. The bustling living community that was your village, with its scattered cottages, its small gardens, its well-trodden paths, its church, its common green, is systematically dismantled and effaced, replaced by a vast, empty, silent pasture, stretching as far as the eye can see, populated only by the Lord's ever-expanding flocks of sheep. Imagine yourself, perhaps a few days or weeks after the eviction, daring to look back from a nearby hill, or the edge of a neighboring still untouched parish. The scene is one of utter desolation. The familiar outlines of your village are gone, or rapidly disappearing. Hedges and fences now crisscross the land, where once the open fields lay, divided into your family's strips and those of your neighbors. The common pasture, once alive with the sounds of village livestock, is now eerily quiet, or perhaps filled with the endless, monotonous bleating of the Lord's sheep. The small stream where you drew water might now be a private watering hole for those same sheep. The woodland edge where you gathered firewood is now part of an enclosed private preserve. The medical hardship for those who try to linger, perhaps hiding in the woods or seeking shelter in abandoned outbuildings, is immense. Exposure, starvation, and the constant fear of discovery by the Lord's men. But for most, there is nothing left to return to. The very fabric of your community has been unraveled. The church, if it still stands, might feel like a hollow shell, its congregation scattered. The village green, once the site of festivals and gatherings, is now just another patch of grazing land. The human endurance is now about grappling with this profound sense of loss, this erasure not just of homes, but of a shared way of life. One quirky, or rather deeply melancholic detail is that the only sounds you might hear now, carried on the wind, are the bleating of sheep and the barking of the shepherd's dogs. The human sounds, the laughter of children, the songs of women at their work, the arguments of men in the alehouse, the call of the village priest, are all silenced, replaced by the relentless, impersonal noise of the new wool-based economy. The scholarly debate often explores the archaeological traces of these deserted medieval villages, DMVs, the faint outlines of house platforms and field systems still visible under pasture land centuries later, ghostly footprints of lost communities. The gory history here is not one of dramatic bloodshed, but of a slow, quiet, yet utterly devastating societal death. Your village, with all its history, its traditions, its interwoven lives, has effectively vanished from the map, its memory actively suppressed, its former inhabitants now scattered to the winds, forced to seek a new, often far harsher, existence elsewhere. The shocking secret is the chilling efficiency with which a vibrant human settlement can be transformed into a silent, empty landscape, all for the sake of a more profitable agricultural model. The sheep now reign where people once lived, a stark green testament to the Lord's right of ruin. You stand, a dispossessed peasant, looking out over the newly enclosed landscape where your village once thrived. The cottages are gone, the common fields are fenced, and as far as the eye can see, there are sheep, thousands upon thousands of them, grazing placidly on the land that once sustained your family and your community. It is in this moment, contemplating this vast, woolly tide that has swept away your entire world, that the full, almost surreal, absurdity and profound cruelty of this progress truly hits you. All this devastation, all this human suffering, all this legal erasure for sheep. The shocking secret is the brutal, almost farcical simplicity of the economic equation that has destroyed your life. The phrase sheep-devouring men, which gained currency during periods of intense enclosure, particularly in Tudor England, now resonates with a terrible, literal truth for you. It's not that the sheep themselves are malevolent, they are merely animals, following their nature, but they have become the instruments, the symbols of a new economic order, an order that values their wool, their marketable fleeces, far more highly than your life, your labor, or your ancient connection to the land. You can almost hear the quirky yet chilling pronouncements of the enclosure advocates. Acre for acre, wool is more profitable than grain. Fewer men, more sheep, means greater returns for the Lord. The medical hardship of your impending starvation is simply a regrettable but necessary externality in their cold calculations of profit. The lord of the manor and the wealthy merchants who buy his wool see these newly enclosed pastures not as a scene of devastation, but as a landscape of efficiency, of productivity, of improvement. They speak of rational land use, of consolidating scattered strips into more manageable blocks, of increasing the national wealth through the burgeoning wool trade. You, however, see only the ghosts of your former life, the lost homes, the scattered community, the silenced laughter. The human endurance required to witness this transformation, to understand that your entire existence has been sacrificed for the market value of a sheep's fleece, is a burden almost too heavy to bear. The scholarly debate around enclosures often grapples with this tension between economic efficiency, at least for the landowners, and social justice. Was enclosure a necessary, if painful, step towards modern agriculture and capitalism? Or was it a brutal act of class warfare, a dispossession of the peasantry by a landed aristocracy eager to maximize their profits? For you, our evicted peasant, the academic arguments are meaningless. You only know the raw, lived experience of loss. You know that the progress that enriched your lord has utterly ruined you. The gory history is not just in the potential violence of the evictions, but in this slower, more systemic violence of economic displacement, of lives deemed less valuable than livestock. As you turn your back on the silent, sheep-dotted fields that were once your home, the bleating of the flocks seems to mock your despair. The shocking secret is that this entire upheaval, this erasure of communities, this creation of a landless, desperate underclass, was often justified by its perpetrators as a necessary, even beneficial, step forward. But for those whose lives were destroyed in the process, it was simply a brutal testament to a world where the bleating of sheep had become a louder, more persuasive, and ultimately more powerful voice than the cries of men, women, and children. Your village has been legally erased, transformed into a silent pasture for the Lord's sheep. You and your family, along with countless other dispossessed peasants, are now cast out, adrift in a world that has suddenly become hostile and unfamiliar. The shocking secret of the Enclosure Edicts extends far beyond the lost fields and demolished cottages. It is written in the suffering, the desperation, and the often tragic fates of those who were forced on the road. This is the beginning of a new, terrifying chapter in your human endurance. Imagine yourself carrying your few remaining possessions on your back, your children clinging to your clothes, their faces etched with hunger and confusion. Where do you go? The neighboring villages are likely already overcrowded, their own common lands perhaps also under threat, their inhabitants wary of newcomers who might strain their meager resources. Some dispossessed families might try to find work as agricultural laborers on the newly enclosed estates or on larger farms, but the demand for such labor is often far less than the supply of desperate people. Sheep farming, after all, requires far fewer hands than arable cultivation. You are now part of a growing army of the landless, the rootless. The roads of medieval and early modern England become your temporary, unforgiving home. You travel from parish to parish, begging for food, for shelter, for a day's work. The medical hardship is immense. Exposure to the elements, the biting winter cold, the drenching rain, the summer heat, takes its toll. Without a proper roof over your head, you sleep in ditches, in barns, if a sympathetic farmer allows it, or under hedgerows. Malnutrition is your constant companion. The food you manage to beg or scavenge is often insufficient and of poor quality. Disease thrives in such conditions. Dysentery, fevers, skin ailments, respiratory infections. Your children are particularly vulnerable. You watch, helpless, as they weaken, their small bodies succumbing to illnesses that, with proper food and shelter, they might have easily overcome. The social stigma is also a heavy burden. You are no longer a respected member of a village community, however humble. You are a vagrant, a sturdy beggar, viewed with suspicion, fear, and contempt by settled society. Parish officials, tasked with managing the poor, are often harsh, eager to drive you and your kind out of their jurisdiction to avoid the cost of providing relief. One quirky, or rather deeply depressing detail, is the development of increasingly punitive poor laws in response to the rise in vagrancy, laws that often criminalized poverty itself rather than addressing its root causes like enclosure. The scholarly debate often explores the long-term social consequences of this mass displacement. Did it contribute to the growth of towns and cities as dispossessed peasants sought work, however menial? Did it fuel social unrest and rebellion? Did it fundamentally alter the structure of English rural society? For you, these are abstract questions. Your reality is the daily struggle to find enough food to keep your family alive for one more day. The constant ache of hunger, the weariness in your bones, the fear of what tomorrow might bring. The gory history is not just in the dramatic act of eviction, but in this slow, grinding attrition of human lives on the open road, a direct consequence of the Lord's right of ruin and his insatiable demand for land for his sheep. Your hope, once rooted in your village and your land, now flickers as precariously as your last hoarded candle against the indifferent wind. You are now part of the swelling ranks of the dispossessed, one of the many thousands of peasant families cast adrift by the Enclosure Edicts, your life reduced to a desperate daily search for sustenance and shelter. But the shocking secret you soon discover is that in the eyes of the law, and often in the eyes of settled society, your very state of homelessness and poverty is increasingly being viewed not as a misfortune to be pitied, but as a crime to be punished. Vagrancy, the crime of being landless, jobless, and wandering, becomes a terrifying new reality, a medical hardship of societal and legal persecution. Imagine the fear that now accompanies your every move, as you trudge from village to village, begging for scraps or hoping for a day's labor. You are constantly looking over your shoulder for the parish constable or the local justice of the peace. The Tudor and early Stuart periods in England, which saw significant waves of enclosure, also saw the enactment of increasingly brutal laws against vagrancy. These laws were designed to control the mobile poor, to force them back into servitude, and to deter others from abandoning their rightful place in the social order, a place that, for you, has been legally erased. You can almost hear the quirky yet terrifying logic. If you don't have land or a master, you must be inherently idle, dissolute, and a threat to public order. The punishments for being deemed a vagrant or a sturdy beggar, meaning one considered capable of work but choosing not to, a cruel irony for those whose work had been taken from them, were horrific. For a first offense, you might be whipped publicly, often until the blood ran down your back. A gory history played out in market squares across the land. You might be clapped in the stocks or the pillory for hours, or even days, exposed to the scorn and missiles, rotten fruit, filth, stones of the local populace. For a second offense, the penalties could escalate, branding with a hot iron, perhaps a V for vagrant on your forehead or chest, marking you for life, or having part of your ear cut off. And for a third offense, In some periods, it could even mean death by hanging. The human endurance required to survive not just the hardship of homelessness, but also the constant threat of such brutal legal sanctions is almost unimaginable. The scholarly debate often considers the motivations behind these harsh vagrancy laws. Were they purely about maintaining social order and deterring crime? Or were they also a convenient way for landowners and employers to ensure a supply of cheap, compliant labor by making the alternative, life on the road, utterly unbearable? The laws often stipulated that vagrants could be forcibly returned to their parish of origin, if they had one, or compelled to enter into service with any master who would take them, often for minimal wages and under harsh conditions. The shocking secret is how the very victims of economic displacement caused by enclosure were then criminalized by the state for their resulting poverty and homelessness. There was little understanding, or perhaps little will to understand, the root causes of this growing social problem. Instead of providing relief or addressing the injustices of enclosure, the legal system often responded with an iron fist, further brutalizing those who had already lost everything. For you, our dispossessed peasant, every encounter with authority is now fraught with peril. The simple act of seeking food or shelter can lead to the lash, the branding iron, or the gallows. Your utter ruin, initiated by the Lord's Enclosure Edict, is now compounded by the cruel machinery of state-sanctioned persecution, the enclosure of common lands and open fields, the legal erasure of your village, the transformation of arable farms into vast sheep pastures. All of this, you were told, or perhaps you overheard the Lord Steward declare with self-righteous conviction, was for the sake of improvement. It was about making agriculture more efficient, land use more rational, and ultimately increasing the wealth and prosperity of the realm. But as you, our dispossessed peasant, now wander the roads, your belly empty and your future bleak, you are forced to confront the shocking secret behind this rhetoric of progress. Who truly benefited from this improvement, and at what devastating human cost? You look back at the newly enclosed estates. Yes, the hedges are neat, the fields perhaps more uniformly managed, for sheep grazing at least. The lord of the manor and the wealthy wool merchants with whom he does business are undoubtedly reaping handsome profits. The price of English wool is high in the continental markets. New manor houses might be built, existing ones expanded, filled with luxuries imported from afar. From the perspective of the landed aristocracy and the rising merchant class, enclosure is an improvement, a successful adaptation to new economic opportunities. You can almost hear them in their warm, well-fed halls, discussing the sound investment that sheep farming represents, perhaps with a quirky or dismissive comment about the unfortunate but necessary displacement of a few inefficient peasants. But what about you and the thousands like you? What about the communities that were dismantled, the ancient way of life that was destroyed? The medical hardship for your class is not just the immediate suffering of eviction and vagrancy, but the long-term consequences of malnutrition, disease, and social marginalization. The human endurance required of you is not to build a better future, but simply to survive the present, to find some way to feed your children in a world that no longer seems to have a place for you. The scholarly debate on the true economic and social impact of enclosures is complex and has continued for centuries. Some economic historians argue that, in the long run, Enclosure did contribute to increased agricultural productivity and was a necessary precursor to the Industrial Revolution by creating a mobile labor force. However, others emphasize the immense social cost, the destruction of rural communities, the widening gap between rich and poor, and the brutal manner in which these changes were often imposed. The gory history is not just in overt violence, but in the cold, systemic violence of economic policies that prioritize profit over people. For you, the evicted peasant, there is no debate. You know who benefited, and you know who paid the price. The improvement that filled your lord's coffers has brought you only ruin. The neatly enclosed fields, now grazed by his sheep, are a constant, bitter reminder of the home, the land, and the livelihood that were legally stolen from you. The shocking secret is that the narrative of progress and efficiency often serves to mask the brutal realities of dispossession and exploitation. The bitter taste of this improvement is the taste of injustice, a flavor that will linger in the collective memory of the English peasantry for generations to come, fueling resentment and occasionally open rebellion against a system that valued sheep more than human souls. The Enclosure Edicts, the destruction of villages for sheep, and the subsequent destitution of countless peasant families did not always pass without challenge. While the power of the lords and the state was immense, the desperation and righteous anger of the dispossessed sometimes boiled over into open, if often tragically doomed, acts of resistance. You, our wandering, ruined peasant, might hear whispers of these uprisings, or perhaps even find yourself swept up in their desperate fervor. The shocking secret is that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can, and did, fight back against the right of ruin. One of the most famous and ultimately tragic examples of such resistance in England was Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk in the summer of 1549, during the reign of young Edward VI, a period when enclosure was a particularly acute grievance. Imagine the scene. Robert Kett, a tanner and landowner himself, though sympathetic to the peasant cause, becomes the leader of a massive popular uprising, initially sparked by protests against enclosures of common land by local gentry. Thousands of peasants, artisans, and disaffected commoners join his cause. They march on Norwich, then England's second largest city, capture it, and establish a remarkable, if short-lived, alternative administration, issuing their own demands for social and economic justice, including an end to illegal enclosures and a reform of abusive landlord practices. You can almost feel the heady mix of hope, defiance, and righteous anger that fueled this human endurance on a mass scale. The gory history of such rebellions, however, is almost invariably their brutal suppression. The Tudor state, like most states of the era, could not tolerate such a direct challenge to its authority and the established social order. A royal army, eventually led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, the same Dudley who would later dominate Edward VI's council, was dispatched to crush Kett's rebellion. The ensuing battle, the Battle of Dussindale, was a massacre. Thousands of poorly armed rebels were slaughtered by the professional, well-equipped royal forces. Robert Kett and other leaders were captured and subsequently executed in a brutal manner, their bodies often displayed as a terrifying warning to others. The medical hardship for the wounded rebels left to die on the field or captured and subjected to harsh treatment would have been immense. Kett's rebellion was not an isolated incident. Throughout the centuries of enclosure, There were numerous local protests, riots, hedge-breaking campaigns, where peasants would tear down the newly erected enclosure fences, and petitions to the crown or parliament. One quirky, or rather poignant, detail is the use of folk songs, ballads, and prophetic rhymes by protesters to articulate their grievances and inspire collective action, a form of oral history that often preserved the memory of these struggles long after official records had sanitized or ignored them. The scholarly debate continues on the true extent and impact of this peasant resistance. While most large-scale rebellions were ultimately crushed, did these acts of defiance have any effect on slowing down the pace of enclosure, or on forcing some concessions from landlords or the state? The shocking secret is that despite the immense power imbalance, the spirit of resistance, born of desperation and a deep sense of injustice, never entirely died. For you, the dispossessed peasant, stories of Ket's rebellion or other, smaller acts of defiance might offer a fleeting, dangerous glimmer of hope, a reminder that others shared your plight and were willing to fight, even die, for a fairer world. But more often, the overwhelming might of the state and the landed aristocracy served as a brutal reinforcement of their right of ruin, a right they were prepared to defend with utter ruthlessness. You have now experienced the full, devastating impact of the Enclosure Edicts, from the first unsettling whispers in your village to the harsh reality of eviction and life on the road. You've seen how your home was legally erased, your livelihood destroyed, all for the sake of sheep. To truly understand how such a profound injustice could occur, you must now, as an observer of history, delve into the shocking secret of the legal and social framework that underpinned it. The very nature of feudal despotism, where law itself was often a tool of the powerful, designed to maintain their dominance and facilitate the exploitation of the weak. Imagine the intricate web of feudal relationships. At the apex is the king, theoretically the ultimate owner of all land. Below him are the great magnates, the tenants-in-chief, who hold vast estates directly from the crown. And further down the pyramid are lesser lords, knights, and then, at the base, the peasantry, including serfs like yourself, bound to the manor, their lives largely dictated by the will of their immediate lord. This hierarchical structure, solidified over centuries, was not just a social order, it was a legal and economic one. The medical hardship of this system, for the peasantry, was the constant pressure of labor and extraction that often left them malnourished and vulnerable. The lord of the manor wielded immense power. He not only owned the land you tilled, but often also controlled the manorial court, which dispensed justice for local disputes and enforced the customs of the manor, customs that, unsurprisingly, tended to favor the lord's interests. You might recall being summoned to this court, perhaps for failing to perform your labor dues, or for a dispute over a stray animal. The proceedings would be in a language you might barely understand, Latin or Norman French in earlier periods, the steward presiding as the lord's representative, and the outcome often predetermined. There was no independent judiciary, no right to legal counsel in the modern sense. The gory history of feudalism is filled with tales of arbitrary judgments and brutal punishments meted out in these local courts. The concept of property rights was also vastly different. While you might have a customary right to your strips of land, passed down through your family, This was ultimately subservient to the lord's ownership of the entire manor. If the lord decided that enclosing the land for sheep pasture was more profitable, or if an act of parliament sanctioned such a change, your customary rights could be legally extinguished, often with minimal or no real compensation. The human endurance of generations of peasants was simply erased by a new legal interpretation or a shift in economic priorities. One quirky, or rather fundamentally unjust, aspect of this system was the way custom could be manipulated. While ancient customs often provided some protection for peasants, lords and their lawyers became adept at reinterpreting or overriding these customs when it suited their economic interests, particularly during the enclosure movements. The scholarly debate explores how the rise of a more centralized state and a more formalized legal system, while in some ways curbing the arbitrary power of individual lords, also provided new tools, like acts of parliament, for the landed classes as a whole to dispossess the peasantry on a grander scale. The shocking secret of feudal despotism, as it relates to the right of ruin through enclosure, is that it was often not a matter of lawlessness, but of law itself being shaped and wielded by and for the powerful. The erasure of your village wasn't necessarily an illegal act. It was often achieved through legal means, however unjust their consequences. This understanding, that law can be an instrument of oppression as much as a guarantor of rights, is perhaps the most chilling lesson from your journey through the lost fields of your former life. The Enclosure Edicts have done their work. Your village, once a vibrant community of families, fields, and common lands, is now a fading memory, a shocking secret buried beneath the encroaching pastures, or slowly returning to wilderness. But the physical traces of these lost settlements, these deserted medieval villages, DMVs as archaeologists later termed them, remain like scars on the English landscape, silent, poignant testaments to the human cost of the Lord's right of ruin and his insatiable demand for land for sheep. Imagine yourself, years later, perhaps as an aging, dispossessed wanderer, or maybe you hear tales from others of revisiting the site of your former home. The once familiar pathways are overgrown. The cottages have crumbled into mere humps and hollows in the earth. Their stone foundations, perhaps, all that remains visible beneath a carpet of grass, where sheep now graze contentedly. The village church, if it was substantial enough to survive, might stand isolated and decaying in a sea of green, its congregation long since scattered. You try to trace the outline of your old cottage, the small garden where you grew your vegetables, the common green where children once played, but the landscape itself seems to actively resist your memory, transformed and alien. The medical hardship here is the ache of irretrievable loss, a wound in the collective memory of your people. Archaeologists, centuries later, would rediscover these lost communities, using techniques like aerial photography, which can reveal the faint outlines of old field systems and house platforms, especially under certain light conditions or after a light snowfall. Geophysical surveys, which can detect buried foundations and ditches, and meticulous excavation. They begin to piece together the stories of these DMVs. You see them in your mind's eye, carefully brushing away the soil, uncovering pottery shards, rusted iron tools, a child's lost toy, a few coins, the humble debris of everyday lives abruptly ended or forced to move elsewhere. Each find is a whisper from the past, a fragment of the gory history of dispossession. The scholarly debate surrounding DMVs is rich, and ongoing. What were the precise causes and timelines for the abandonment of specific villages? While enclosure for sheep farming is a major, well-documented factor, especially in certain regions and periods, like the Midlands in the 15th to 16th centuries, or later with parliamentary enclosures, other factors could also contribute, such as plague, like the Black Death, which did lead to some village desertions, soil exhaustion, or shifts in trade routes. However, the deliberate, legally sanctioned clearing of villages for pasture remains a dominant theme in many areas. One quirky, or rather telling, detail is how local folklore often preserves the memory of these lost villages, sometimes with tales of sunken churches whose bells can still be heard on certain nights, or of ghostly inhabitants still wandering their former fields. The human endurance is that of memory itself, the way stories of these lost places and the injustice of their destruction are passed down, even if only in hushed tones or folk songs. The shocking secret that the archaeology of DMVs reveals is the sheer scale of this rural depopulation in certain periods. It's not just isolated farms, but entire communities that were wiped off the map, their human inhabitants replaced by a more profitable form of livestock. These grassy humps and hollows, these faint traces in the landscape, are the quiet, enduring scars of a brutal economic transformation, a physical record of when villages were indeed legally erased for sheep, the Enclosure Edicts, the displacement of your peasant family, the transformation of your village into sheep pasture. These events, though rooted in the medieval and early modern past, cast a long, profound shadow, shaping the very fabric of modern British society, and indeed influencing the development of agricultural and economic systems worldwide. As you, the observer, look beyond your personal utter ruin, you begin to see the shocking secret of how this right of ruin, wielded by landlords for centuries, became a crucial, if brutal, catalyst for vast historical changes. The most immediate and visible impact, as you experienced firsthand, was the creation of a large, landless rural population, with access to common lands extinguished and their small holdings consolidated into larger farms or sheep runs. Countless peasant families were forced off the land. This didn't just mean personal hardship. It fundamentally altered the social structure of the countryside. The old manorial system, with its complex web of customary rights and obligations, gradually gave way to a more capitalist form of agriculture, characterized by large, privately owned estates, tenant farmers, often with less security than before, and a growing class of wage laborers dependent on seasonal work. You can imagine the medical hardship of this new precarious existence for many. This newly landless population often had little choice but to migrate, seeking work wherever they could find it. Some became agricultural wage laborers, their human endurance now tested by insecure employment and low pay. Many others drifted towards the growing towns and cities, providing a ready and often desperate pool of labor that would eventually fuel the Industrial Revolution. The scholarly debate is intense on this point. To what extent was enclosure a direct and necessary precursor to industrialization? While not the sole factor, the displacement of rural populations undoubtedly contributed to the urbanization and the formation of an industrial working class that characterized 18th and 19th century Britain. One quirky detail: some early factories were even built in rural areas, specifically to take advantage of this displaced, impoverished labor pool. Enclosure also had a profound impact on the English landscape itself, creating the familiar patchwork of fields bounded by hedges that we often associate with the quintessential English countryside. This was a landscape born of social upheaval, its neatness belying the human cost of its creation. Furthermore, the focus on sheep farming and wool production spurred the growth of the English textile industry, a key component of its rising economic power on the world stage. The gory history of peasant dispossession in this grand narrative of national progress is often downplayed or presented as an unfortunate but unavoidable side effect. The shocking secret of Enclosure's long shadow is how a process rooted in the greed and power of individual landlords and the seemingly mundane desire for more profitable land use could have such far-reaching and transformative consequences, contributing to the decline of feudalism, the rise of capitalism, the growth of cities, and even the reshaping of global trade patterns. The story of your legally erased village is not just a local tragedy. It's a microcosm of a vast historical process that remade a nation, often at a terrible human price. A process whose echoes can still be discerned in the social and economic structures of our world today. The grand sweep of history, the economic transformations, the rise and fall of systems. These are abstract concepts to you, our dispossessed peasant. Your reality is far more personal, far more immediate, far more devastating. The Enclosure Edict, the surveyor's chain, the rising hedges, the eviction notice, the demolition of your home. These were not just historical processes. They were the instruments of your utter ruin, the systematic destruction of your world and your hope. As you sit by a cold roadside or huddle for shelter in a makeshift lean-to, your mind inevitably turns back to what was lost, a shocking secret of grief and desolation that no historical statistic can ever truly capture. You remember the small cottage, smoky and cramped perhaps, but yours by custom and generations of inhabitants. You recall the feel of the earth in your hands as you tilled your strips in the open field, the scent of the wild flowers on the common, the taste of the pottage, however meager, cooked over your own hearth. These were not just physical sensations. They were the very fabric of your existence, the anchors of your identity. Now, they are gone, replaced by the gnawing ache of hunger, the bite of the wind, and the constant wearying uncertainty of a life without roots. The medical hardship is not just physical illness, but this profound spiritual and emotional sickness born of loss and despair. You think of your community, the village that was legally erased for sheep. You remember the shared labor of plowing and harvesting, the boisterous gatherings at the alehouse, the solemn rituals in the village church, the comfort of knowing your neighbors, of belonging to a place. Now, that community is scattered, its bonds broken. Some, like you, wander the roads. Others may have found precarious work elsewhere. Some, undoubtedly, have already succumbed to starvation, disease, or the sheer hopelessness of their new existence. The human endurance required to simply keep putting one foot in front of the other, to care for your children in this desolate new world, feels almost superhuman. Yet it is a burden you must bear every single day. The gory history you have witnessed is not of battles fought with swords and shields, but of a quieter, more insidious violence. The violence of legal documents, of economic calculations, of a social order that deems your life less valuable than a field of grazing sheep. There are no heroic sagas sung of your struggle, no monuments erected to your suffering. Your ruin is largely silent, unrecorded, an inconvenient footnote in the grand narrative of progress and improvement. One quirky, or rather, deeply melancholic reflection might be on the sheep themselves. They are innocent creatures, yet they have become the unwitting symbols of your destruction. Their placid grazing, their endless numbers, are a constant, painful reminder of everything you have lost. The scholarly debate might analyze the economic efficiencies of wool production, but for you, the only reality is the gaping hole where your life used to be. The shocking secret of your utter ruin is its totality. It is not just the loss of land or home, but the loss of identity, of community, of security, of hope itself. You are a ghost in a landscape that no longer recognizes you, a forgotten casualty of a lord's ambition and the relentless, impersonal march of economic change. Your world did not end with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable planting of a hedge and the bleating of sheep on land that once held your dreams.